Universities across Africa, with a case study of University of Nigeria and Nsukka, can contribute to the SDGs 4 and 13 much more broadly by supporting the advancement of the goals through green creativity. This study further highlights eco-poetry, eco-musicology, and eco-photography as forms of green creativity which can be used in enhancing climate change communication in Africa. It concludes with a clarion call for a deeper research on maximizing the role of green creativity in enhancing climate change communication for sustainable development in Africa. The next slide. The next slide. Okay. Data used for this study is derived from published works, including academic articles, journals, conference proceedings, book chapters, textbooks, and other internet materials. The researcher gathered a lot of materials, but summarize the characteristics that centered more on enhancing climate change communication through green creativity in Africa. Next slide. The next slide, okay. So what is climate change? We've been talking about climate change for some days now, but it's still very important for us to understand what it's all about. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change defines climate change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. Okay, from this diagram, you can see a clean and green environment at one side, and at the other side, you can see an environment that is choked up with pollution, air pollution, and all manner of greenhouse gases, making it unhealthy for living. So today we're going to make a choice whether we want a clean environment, a clean and green environment, or we want an environment choked up with environmental pollution. Today we're going to make our choice. Okay, the next slide. Next slide. Okay, the impacts of climate change in Africa. Climate change poses an immediate and long-term threat to our environment, our people, and our planet. The impacts of climate change can be felt across communities, cities, campuses, and countries in Africa in a profound way. There is growing evidence that many of the developing countries in Africa, including Nigeria, have in recent times experienced climate disasters such as flooding, erosion, drought, that threaten the well-being of people and the environment. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, in understanding climate change, we have the adaptation, we have mitigation, and we have resilience. Next slide. Next slide, okay. Climate change adaptation refers to adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And climate mitigation is any action taken to eliminate or reduce the long-term risks and hazards of climate change to human life, property, and the society. Climate resilience is a capacity for a socio-ecological system to adapt, absorb pressures, and maintain function in the face of external stresses imposed upon it by climate change. So you can see that climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and climate resilience are very, very important in climate change, in achieving sustainable development, SDG 13 in Nigeria and in Africa as a whole. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, these pictures highlight the impact of climate change in Africa. This is a challenge of flooding. You can see a young girl almost submerged in the waters. And you can see another building here that has become literally uninhabitable because of flooding. And then you can see women trying to do their businesses in an environment of flooding. You can see that flooding has a lot of negative impact in Africa. The next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the next slide, these are pictures of erosion in Africa. Okay, in one of the pictures, you can see a building, a two-story building that is almost submerged by erosion. And you can see the environmental degradation that is caused by flooding, by erosion in Africa. So erosion is one of the impacts of climate change that is having a negative impact in various communities in Africa. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so education is an essential element of global response to climate change. Climate change education is therefore very vital in every community in order to prepare us for climate change impacts and to learn how to adapt and mitigate effectively. Climate change education aims to explore and explain the causes and the impacts of climate change and the necessary adaptation and mitigation measures. Next slide. Next one. Okay, next slide. The next one. Okay, climate change education is therefore vital in every community in order to prepare us for climate change impacts and to learn how to adapt effectively. Climate change education for sustainable development therefore has a central role to play in helping the general public and especially the next generation understand and relate to the issues of climate change and make lifestyle changes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the changing local conditions. Next slide. Next one. Okay, so this is the Climate Change Education at World Environment Day 2020 Summit held at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. So you can see Ambassador Benjamin, that's myself, and some other professors from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. We had the World Environment Day Summit, a climate change education event, and we were able to communicate to a global audience on the impacts of climate change and ways to adapt and mitigate for global sustainability. There were also poetry recitations, and this is just an example of climate change education initiatives being carried out in Nigeria, especially at the University of Nigeria. So the next slide. The next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, climate change communication. Climate change communication refers to the process of disseminating information about climate change in an effective and engaging manner. This includes educating the public about the science of climate change, as well as highlighting the impacts of climate change and promoting efforts to mitigate and adapt to its effects. Climate change communication has become increasingly important in recent years as the need for urgent action to address the climate crisis has become more pressing. Next slide. The next slide, please. Okay, so this is a climate change communication event we had at a workshop on the environmental conservation and sustainability held in Nigeria in April. So you can see me sharing my poem, Our Climate, Our Health. So this is just an example of climate change communication strategies and initiatives going on in Nigeria at the time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so green creativity. Well, we want to look at green creativity because green creativity has a vital role to play in enhancing climate change communication in Africa and also in ensuring sustainable development. Green creativity can be expressed. Green creativity refers to the development of new ideas about green innovations, green services, green processes, and green practices that are novel and useful. Green creativity also refers to the ability to generate innovative ideas that promote sustainability, reduce environmental impact, and also encourage eco-friendly practices. Green creativity is vital for sustainable, clean, and green environment. Okay, so forms of next slide. Okay, forms of green creativity, eco-poetry, eco-musicology, and eco-photography. There may be other forms of green creativity, but these are the three that we're going to focus on in this study because I know we have climate storytelling and some other forms of green creativity that can be used to mitigate enhance climate change communication. But for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on three of them: eco-poetry, eco-musicology, and eco-photography. Next slide. Okay, eco-poetry involves the use of poetry in conveying the message of climate change adaptation and mitigation for sustainable development. Eco-photography involves the use of photographs of natural environment for artistic research or monitoring purposes towards enhancing climate resilience. Eco-musicology involves the use of music in conveying the message of climate change adaptation and mitigation for sustainable development in Africa and beyond. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so this is a case study of eco-poetry. I'm going to just recite the poem to express to you how poetry can be used to inspire hope and enhance climate change communication in Africa. Okay, the title of the poem says, Time for Nation. Nature's voice calls a rebirth. Nature's choice is clean and green. Feel and enjoy her sweet scent. It's a beautiful world we live in. Nature's voice calls for hope and health. Nature's choice is peace and progress. Our heritage of wit and wealth. Nature's gift to be judiciously harnessed. It is time for nature to be nurtured. Nature is a precious gift from divine, a precious gift to be treasured. Time for nature, it is time. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, nature's voice calls for caution and care. Nature's choice is relish and relish. Both plants and animals and humans are there, refuse to be foolish and selfish. Nature's voice we surely can hear. Nature's choice is beauty and grandeur. The health of the planet is our desire. It is time for nature. Next slide. Okay, so you can see from the poem how it expresses the importance of caring for nature and the beauty of nature. Understanding for eco-photography has environmental, psychological, socioeconomic, mental, and emotional components and also benefits. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are examples of eco-photography. You can see with these pictures about the environment, eco-photography, you can use it to educate communities about what is happening at various locations. You can use it to raise funds for various locations. You can use it in research purposes. So this is a typical example of eco-photography. Because of my time, I will not go into details of everything I wanted to share about eco-photography. Next slide. Next one. In understanding ecomusicology, my case study is a music advanced by Mr. Lohman Krizinja, a poet and pianist based in South Africa. The title of the music is The Wonders of This Place. This music actually talks about the environment and why it is very important for us to take good care of our environment. So I have the links for the music are posted. The YouTube links are posted on these slides. So you can take a look at those. You can click the link and then go through the music. Just shows you what ecomusicology can do and how ecomusicology can be used in enhancing climate change communication in Africa. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, my recommendations and conclusion. Bring creativity, which includes the use of eco-poetry, ecomusicology, and eco-photography, has been identified to have numerous psychological, emotional, mental, socioeconomic, and environmental benefits. There is therefore need for further research on the subject matter of green creativity, which should be undertaken by researchers in the field of environmental sustainability across various communities, cities, campuses, and countries in Africa. Through this study, it is clearly seen that green creativity is a valuable tool which can be used to enhance climate change communication for sustainable development in Africa. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you for listening. References are available on